The ocean does not forgive mistakes. It does not care about your plans, your family, your dreams, or the fact that you promised someone you would be home by sunset. Out there, beyond the shoreline where the world becomes nothing but water and sky, a human life can be reduced to a single trembling heartbeat inside a tiny wooden shell. And that is exactly where this story begins, with a man who was not supposed to survive one night, let alone 47 days. Before you go any further, stay with this story until the end, because what happened out on that endless water was not just survival. It was a test of will, a battle against hunger, madness, loneliness, terror, and the cruelest silence a human being can ever hear. And if stories like this move you, make sure you like, comment, share, and subscribe, because this one is the kind you do not forget once it reaches your heart. It began as an ordinary day, the kind that begins without warning and ends with everything changed forever. The sea looked calm enough to trust. The wind was gentle. The horizon stretched wide and beautiful, almost inviting. That is the danger of the ocean. It can look peaceful right before it becomes a monster. The man at the center of this story had gone out with routine in his mind and confidence in his chest. He knew the water well, or so he believed. He had done this before. He had seen rough weather before. He had felt fear before. But nothing in his life had prepared him for the moment when the sky darkened, the waves rose, and the world began to break apart around him. At first there was confusion, then panic, then the raw animal instinct that arrives when a person realizes that survival is no longer a choice but a command. His vessel was not made for a war with nature. It was small, vulnerable, and suddenly no longer in control of anything. A violent shift of weather, a catastrophic failure, a disaster too fast to resist, and in a matter of moments everything familiar disappeared. Land vanished. Direction vanished. Help vanished. The radio failed or was lost in the chaos. The boat, if one could still call it that, became his entire universe, and that universe was shrinking by the second. The first night was the worst kind of nightmare because it was not a dream. It was cold water hitting his skin. It was darkness swallowing every shape. It was the sound of waves striking the hull like fists against a coffin. He held on with white knuckles and a racing mind, telling himself that morning would bring rescue, that someone would find him, that this nightmare had to end soon. Human beings are built to believe in soon. It keeps us alive, but the ocean has no respect for soon. Morning came, but rescue did not. The sun rose like an accusation. It revealed the vastness of the water, the emptiness, the merciless scale of his situation. No ships, no land, no birds at first, no voices, just endless blue stretching in every direction like a lie. He looked for any sign of the world he knew and found none. That was the moment hope began to change shape. It no longer looked like certainty. It became something thinner, harder, and more fragile. Hope became a task, a choice. A thing he would have to carry deliberately, because nobody else could carry it for him. The first days were a blur of physical survival. He rationed what little food and water he had. He counted every swallow, every bite, every drop mattered. Hunger arrives differently when you are trapped at sea. It does not politely wait in the background. It becomes a living thing inside your body, clawing at you from within. It makes your thoughts slow, then sharp, then wild. It teaches you what desperation tastes like. He began to understand that surviving would not be a heroic single act. It would be 1,000 tiny decisions repeated under impossible pressure. One more sip, one more knot tied, one more minute awake, one more prayer whispered into the wind. But the sea was not finished with him. It sent heat by day and cold by night. It sent salt into every wound. It cracked his lips until they bled. It baked his skin under a sun that felt closer than mercy and harsher than punishment. And when the storms came, they came like judgment. Waves climbed over the boat, slammed into him, soaked everything, and threatened to erase whatever fragile order he had managed to build. He was never allowed to settle. Every moment was either preparation or recovery. There was no rest, only pauses between threats. As the days passed, time lost its shape. Morning and evening began to blur together. He marked days by the position of the sun, by the movement of the stars, by the pain in his body, by the growing weakness in his limbs. He may have started with confidence, but confidence is one of the first things the sea strips away. In its place came something deeper. Determination, yes, but also fear so intense it became almost companionable. He learned to sit beside fear without obeying it. That was perhaps the hardest lesson of all. Not the hunger, not the thirst, not the storms. The hardest lesson was silence, because silence at sea is never empty. It is loud with absence. It reminds you that nobody is coming unless you find a way to survive long enough to be found. There were moments when he spoke aloud just to hear a human voice, even if it was his own. He talked to himself. He talked to the boat. He talked to the sky. He talked to his family in the dark, imagining their faces, hearing their laughter in his memory, holding on to the sound of people who loved him. Memory became medicine. He replayed every small thing that meant home, the smell of food, the warmth of a room, the shape of a familiar doorway, the pressure of a handshake. The simple miracle of standing on solid ground. When a person is lost at sea, even the smallest ordinary thing becomes sacred. But the body has its own clock, and it does not care about bravery. Dehydration began to weaken him, his vision blurred, his muscles cramped, his skin burned, his tongue swelled with thirst. He became dizzy, then disoriented, then afraid of his own thoughts. At times he would see things that were not there, a shadow in the water, a distant shoreline, a voice carried by the wind. Sometimes he knew immediately it was not real. Other times the hallucinations were so convincing that his heart leapt before the truth crushed it again. That is what exhaustion does. It steals the line between reality and hope, and then forces you to live on that trembling edge. He made mistakes, and each mistake at sea could become fatal. A bad judgment call, a slipped grip, a decision delayed too long. He had to learn constantly, adapt constantly, fight constantly. There was no room for pride, no room for pretending he was fine. The ocean punishes arrogance quickly. Humility was the only shield he had. He learned to respect every cloud, every current, every change in the wind. He watched the water with the attention of someone reading a language he could not afford to misunderstand. Even then, the sea remained bigger than his understanding. It was always bigger. There were nights when fear became so heavy that sleep felt dangerous. Yet exhaustion eventually forced him under, and when he slept lightly, as if the slightest dream might become another storm. He woke to wetness, to rocking motion, to the ache of a body slowly being worn down. Sometimes he would wake thinking he had heard another boat. Sometimes he would wake to the terrifying thought that he had been forgotten by the entire world. The sea can make a person feel erased. It can make you question whether your life matters to anyone beyond the horizon. In those moments, survival becomes more than physical. It becomes spiritual. You survive by insisting that your existence still matters, even when everything around you says otherwise. 47 days is a long time to be alone, long enough for fear to mature, long enough for hope to be tested and retested until it becomes either unbreakable or gone, long enough for a person to learn what he is made of. And what he was made of, it turned out, was not just toughness. It was stubbornness, memory, pain, faith, and a refusal to surrender to the water. He was exhausted, yes. Broken in places, yes. But inside him was a core that the sea could not reach. Each day he survived was a quiet rebellion against death. He had to improvise in every possible way. He searched for ways to capture rain. He protected whatever supplies remained like treasure. He used whatever skills he had, however small, and built a routine around survival because routine can save a mind from collapse. He kept track of the sun, watched for birds, watched for debris, watched for anything that might bring a hint of land or life. Every tiny sign mattered. A floating object, a shift in color, a bird circling in the distance. The universe had become so large and so empty that even a speck of evidence felt like a miracle. But miracles do not always arrive in the form we expect. Sometimes a miracle is simply waking up. Sometimes it is surviving one more storm. Sometimes it is keeping your mind intact long enough to ask for help again tomorrow. He had days where he could feel despair pressing against him like the water itself, but he fought it by remembering that despair is a liar. It tells you that suffering is permanent. It tells you that because you cannot see the end, there is no end. But the man out there on the open sea kept proving that the lie was not the truth. The truth was that pain could be endured, time could pass, a body could weaken and still remain alive, a spirit could bend and still not break. As the 47th day approached, something changed. It was not sudden, it was not cinematic, it was a thin thread of possibility, the kind that appears only after a person has almost given up expecting it. Maybe it was the root of a passing vessel, maybe it was luck, maybe it was all the unseen hands that had carried him 1 hour at a time to this exact point. But then, at last, there was movement in the distance. At first he doubted it. The mind of a stranded person learns caution, because hope can hurt more than hunger when it dies. He looked again, squinting against the light, trying not to believe too quickly. Then it became real. A boat, a rescue, human beings, voices, the sound of life approaching him instead of receding away. For a moment he could not react. His body had spent so long preparing for death that the possibility of being saved felt unreal. And yet there it was, undeniable. After 47 days of isolation, of heat, hunger, thirst, fear, storms, and silence, the world had finally reached back for him. He was found. People often imagine rescue as pure joy, but survival that long leaves its mark. Relief came first, then disbelief, then the overwhelming crash of everything he had been holding in. The body, once commanded to endure, suddenly had permission to feel. Weakness poured through him. Emotion followed. Tears came not because he was weak, but because he had been strong for so long. Every part of him that had been locked in survival mode began to thaw all at once. He was not just saved from the sea. He was returned to humanity. When he finally touched solid ground again, it must have felt impossible. Land beneath his feet, stability, faces close enough to see clearly, voices without the roar of waves behind them. The world had not ended after all. Life had kept moving, and he had made it back into it. Not untouched, not unchanged, but alive. Alive in a way that made every breath feel earned. Alive in a way that would permanently change how he saw every sunrise, every meal, every conversation, every ordinary day most people never think to appreciate. The physical recovery would take time, because the body remembers what it has endured. The mental recovery would take even longer, because the mind does not forget 47 days of terror, isolation, and uncertainty. But survival had already done its deepest work. It had taught him that human beings are capable of far more than they believe when they are forced into the edge of existence. It had taught him that courage is not the absence of fear. It is the decision to keep going while fear is screaming in your ear. It had taught him that hope is not a feeling that arrives before the struggle. It is the discipline that carries you through the struggle until rescue appears. And maybe that is why this story matters so much. Because most of us will never be lost at sea. Most of us will never face 47 days alone on open water with no guarantee of being found. But all of us at some point face our own ocean, our own storm, our own long stretch of silence where we do not know when relief will come. We all have moments when the world feels too big, the burden too heavy, the future too far away. And in those moments, this story reminds us that survival is not always about winning quickly. Sometimes it is about enduring faithfully. Sometimes it is about taking the next breath, then the next, until the impossible turns into memory. So remember this, the sea was massive, indifferent, and dangerous, but a single human life still fought back. 47 days of struggle did not erase him. It revealed him. It showed that the human spirit, when pushed to the brink, can become fiercer than fear and brighter than despair. That is the real miracle. Not that he was lost, but that he refused to let being lost become the end of his story. And if this story stayed with you, let it stay for the right reason. Appreciate your life while it is calm. Value the people who love you while they are near. Do not wait for a storm to teach you gratitude. And when life feels like endless water with no shore in sight, remember this man adrift for 47 days. Because his journey proves that even in the darkest, loneliest, most hopeless places, survival is possible. The lesson is simple, but it is powerful. Never underestimate the human will, never insult the power of hope, and never give up on yourself when the horizon looks empty, because sometimes the rescue you need is already on its way.